Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this presentation, Data Management Plans 101. I'd first like to thank the Office of Research Development for the opportunity to talk to you all today, and all of you for taking time out of your day to come and listen to this presentation. Just a brief outline of what we'll be talking about today. We'll be focusing on data management plans for grants compliance. We'll start off with some definitions, defining data. We'll talk a little bit about the research data lifecycle. We'll define data management and talk exactly what we mean when we say research data management. And then we'll really dive a little bit more into those federal funder requirements. We'll go over some resources that we offer here at FSU through FSU Libraries to help you build your DMP. And then we'll finish off, with those resources, contact information, and with some time for questions. All right, and I'm going to mute my video for internet purposes. All right, so to start off, there are a lot of different definitions for research data, as data is different depending on what field or discipline you're in or what your research focus is. If I was to ask everybody that's attending today's webinar for their definition of data, I would get a different answer from every single person for those reasons. So for today, since we'll primarily be talking about data management in terms of compliance with public access and funder mandates, we'll use the definition from the Code of Federal Regulations, which is the recorded factual material commonly accepted in the scientific community as necessary to validate research findings. And here, when we say scientific community, we could also broadly interpret that to mean research community. So factual material commonly accepted in the research community necessary to validate research findings. There are some common examples of research data and some examples that aren't so common. So the obvious examples are things we think about every day, right? So documents, spreadsheets, audio, visual, cell images, photographs, and those sorts of things. Some things that are not so obvious, as shown on the right, are things like lab notebooks or field notes, code books, methodologies, or standard operating procedures. These consist mostly of methods and parameters and documentation used to collect data and verify it. These are still required to completely validate the data from a research study. So you'll want to think of the stuff on the right as well when you're thinking about writing your data management plans. There are some examples of things that are not research data. This is certain documentation that you may produce as part of a research project that doesn't necessarily need to be included in a data management plan or a data inventory. This includes things like preliminary drafts of papers, plans for future research, and private communications with colleagues. So now that we've defined data and we've talked a little bit about some different types of data, I want to spend just a moment to talk about the research data lifecycle. This is a general schema for the different steps of a research project and the process that data undergoes throughout the course of the project. To note, some projects may only use, we went backwards. Some projects may only use part of this cycle, and other projects may not follow this exact path. I know it shows on here that it's linear, but this may not exactly follow a linear fashion. And researchers are often engaged in multiple aspects of this cycle at once, both as a creator of data and as a data user. For today's presentation, we will focus mostly on the plan step. This involves compiling a description of the data that will be compiled and how that data will be managed and made accessible throughout its lifetime. So when we talk about research data management, what are we thinking? So research data management, broadly speaking, is a concept that includes processes undertaken to create organized, documented, accessible, and reusable quality research data. Research data management ensures that the results of scholarship are reproducible and verifiable by future scholars in the fields or future researchers that may be using your work. This all starts with creating a comprehensive data management plan, ideally at the outset of your research project. So why manage research data? There's several reasons for doing so, and they can nicely be summed by this little carrot and sticks table that I've got shown here on the screen. So managing your research data will save time. It's in a researcher's best interest to do this so that you're able to locate past or current data and accompanying metadata when you're thinking about later stages of your project. Well-managed data is easy to share, which can lead to the data itself being cited. So your data could be cited by other researchers. Data management enhances reproducibility by making your methodologies more important. And this also benefits researchers, ensuring that their data is preserved, not just stored, preserved for long-term abilities to access and use that data. Some of the sticks or some of the reasons that a lot of us think about managing data and why this conversation has kind of taken off in the last few years is funders and journals have begun to require data sharing as a requirement of publication or award acceptance. A variety of government funding agencies, such as the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health, and private funders now require data management plans as part of funding applications. And that's what we'll spend a good portion of today's talk discussing. And then accessible data protects from retraction. When someone, maybe tries to reproduce your work, there's that data being openly available allows them something to compare it to and validate the work. So some common issues when we think about data management. Obviously, the first one, not doing it at all, or waiting until later on in the project to sit down and actually write a plan for managing your data. That's a common occurrence, although less so in the last few years, is starting a research project and not really having a good idea of how your data is going to be documented, how you're going to preserve it long term, how you're going to store it. Saving data only in proprietary file formats that can only be accessed by certain software. Other researchers may not have access to this software, or that software might become obsolete in 10 years. If somebody's trying to look at your data, they're not going to be able to do so. So saving it in sort of non-proprietary or universal formats is important. Having incomplete and or incoherent data, so having missing data, or a lack of data documentation. So not having appropriate documentation of the methodologies, of the types of analysis that you're using. So recognizing the seriousness of these issues and the effect that it's had on the credibility of funded research, the federal government in 2013 decided to take action. So on screen is a quote from the Office in Science and Technology Policy memo produced during the Obama administration in 2013. And essentially this memo required that any agency, so any federal agency that receives more than $100 million in annual conduct of research and development expenditures, required them to develop guidelines to support increased public access to the results of research. So this included the guidelines for peer-reviewed publications, as well as data. So you might have heard of open access publications and things in that realm. So peer-reviewed publications was one aspect of it, but also the ability to make data openly available and accessible for the long term. So after this memo came out, several funding agencies quickly followed suit and developed guidelines along with some private funding agencies as well. So these are just a few examples that we show on the screen. Obviously, there are many other funding agencies. So we'll now dive a little bit into just a couple of funding agencies and their guidelines and sort of use those as a benchmark for what you typically see and want to include in a data management plan. So the first example I'm going to show is the NSF Directorate for Biological Sciences. So the National Science Foundation has several directorates depending on what discipline you are in, and each of those is just a little bit different, but most of them include much of the same information that they want in their data management plans. So the first thing is types of data. So what kind of data are you collecting? Are they physical samples or collections? Is it a type of software that you're producing? Are they field samples? Is it laboratory work? Next is to describe the standards to be used for all the data types anticipated, including file formats and metadata. So discussing what file formats you're going to use. If you remember just a couple of minutes ago, I mentioned proprietary and non-proprietary file formats. This is where you'd want to stipulate a non-proprietary file format to be used so that your data would be accessible to future researchers, such as a CSV file or a TXT file. And then every field has some sort of metadata standard or standard for documenting, how you're collecting your data, how you're analyzing your data, and you'll want to talk about those standards here. The roles and responsibilities of all parties involved. So this is where you would include who's responsible for the execution of the data management plan. In most cases, it's normally the PI, but if it's somebody other than the PI, or if you have a co-PI, you would mention that here. Dissemination methods. So how are you going to disseminate that data? How are you going to ensure that it gets disseminated in a way that makes it available to the research community? You'll want to talk about dissemination both during and after the grant ends. So whether that's in peer-reviewed publications or at scientific meetings, etc. Policies for data sharing and public access. So this was a big part of that initial federal memo, is how are you going to ensure that the data is publicly available and accessible throughout the course of the project, but more importantly, after the project concludes. So are you going to deposit it in an institutional or discipline-specific repository? Or is there another method you're going to use? Here's where you would also include if there are any intellectual property rights associated with the research, or if there's an IRB that's needed for your project. And then finally, plans for archiving data and ensuring its longevity and accessibility. So next is the NIH, and the NIH is a little bit different in how they want you to write your data management plan. They actually call it a data sharing plan. This is a brief paragraph immediately following the research plan section. As you'll see here, there's a lot of the same information that they want. They want a description of the data you've collected, the data formats, how you're going to disseminate that data, a timeline for disseminating that. Are there any allowable embargoes on when that data is going to be shared, and I want you to explain the reason for that, and a description of the data documentation that you're going to use. So for the NIH, there are a few other considerations that you'll want to think about when you're writing your data sharing plan. Applicants may request funds in their application for data sharing. So if this requires the development of a, say, new repository, or there's any sort of cost associated with making your data publicly available for the long term, that can be written into the application. If the research involves human subjects, you'll need to discuss how the rights and confidentiality of participants will be protected. So this would be another place where you could also include sort of the nature of the IRB application that would be submitted for this project. And then the last one I'm going to talk about here as an example is the United States Department of Energy. So you can see they have 5 sections as of their latest advice. And again, they want data types and sources. So just a brief high-level description of the data that's generated. They want to know the content and format. This includes a description of your documentation plans, data sharing and preservation, protection. And then one thing that's different with Department of Energy grants than the first 2 is they want a discussion of the rationale or justification for the proposed data management plan, including broader impacts for the immediate field and any broader societal impact. I'm going to stop here briefly and see if we have any questions. Evangeline, do we have any questions so far?
The only one that's come in so far has been a request if we're able to share a copy of the PowerPoint with everyone.
Yes, definitely. I will. I'll send that to you after this talk, and then you can distribute it.
Wonderful. That's all that's come in so far.
All right, great. All right, so as you can see from those previous guidelines and those previous guidance from the funding agencies, although they may all differ a little bit in some of the things that they want, there's some general information that you're going to need to keep track of and include in whatever data management plan that you are writing. And this is pretty much true of most funding agencies, and it's just good to keep track of throughout your research process. So the types of data materials produced, whether that's observational, experimental data, tabular data, audio data. This is where you'll sort of list the data types you'll be producing throughout your research project. Always keep track of file formats. Data should always be made available in non-proprietary file formats in the end. And it should be made openly available whenever possible. Now, I will note that as you're working through your research project, sometimes you'll be working with proprietary software or instrument-based software. It is okay to save, copies of that as you go in whatever format that software produces. But it's always good in the end to save another copy of it as a non-proprietary file format as well. Most software now has the ability to do that. Metadata standards. So how are you documenting your data and procedures, and what standards are you using? Most fields have metadata standards. A lot of times your grant applications or the call for proposals will discuss a particular standard that either they would like to see used or something that they suggest. So just a quick note on file formats. These are just some examples of different types of data and some common software that might be used. I know here it's very much skewed towards sort of Microsoft Office software, but that's used in a lot of instances. So if you have something like a Microsoft Word document or a Microsoft Excel document, you can save those as a TXT or a CSV file. So further data management plan requirements. How will you ensure that the data meets funder data sharing and public access guidelines? All funders have public access data sharing guidelines. Some of them are a little more stringent than others, and they are evolving, every year or every other year. Funding agencies are coming out with firmer and firmer data sharing guidelines. And that's something that if you're unsure of, we at FSU Libraries can help you with. And policies for archiving and preserving the data. How will the data be preserved for long-term access? Typically, this involves depositing that data into a data repository where other researchers can access that data. And then who can access that? Are there restrictions on who can access the data at what points in time? Are there any sort of embargoes that have to be considered? And then data privacy, copyright, and intellectual property rights, if they're applicable to the project. So just to define a little bit on data documentation, just so that we have an idea of what that is. I won't spend a whole lot of time on this. But data documentation, as I've sort of mentioned already, it's information about the data set itself that allows other researchers to understand the data and how it was analyzed and how it was produced. So some different types are README files, code books, data dictionaries, research methods, and analytical strategies. And then data repositories. So I've mentioned data repositories a few times, so I want to talk about that a little bit because it's an important part of pretty much every data management plan. So data repositories help preserve your data and curate it in a way that is FAIR. So FAIR is this acronym that's come out in the data community the last few years. So this FAIR means findable, accessible, interoperable, and reproducible. So findable, the data and any supplementary materials have sufficiently rich metadata or documentation and a unique and persistent identifier. Accessible means that the data is understandable to both humans and machines, since much of our data is read on instruments or computers or digital formats, and that data is deposited in a trusted repository. Interoperable means that metadata uses a accessible and broadly applicable language. And then reusable data and collections have clear usage licenses and provide accurate information on provenance. So just some examples of repositories. ICPSR, which was on the previous screen, the Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Research. That is a data repository for social sciences. Dryad is a biomedical sciences data repository, and GitHub, which some folks may have heard of, is a code repository where you can find open source code. These are examples of discipline-specific repositories, and there's many different discipline-specific repositories out there. A listing of all of those can be found on re3data.org, and I'm going to give a brief demonstration of that in just a second. There are also institutional repositories, often associated with universities. Our institutional repository here is Diginal. And then another example is data.gov. So this is a repository that contains research data produced by researchers directly working for a government agency. So somebody working at NSF or somebody working at NIH. So this is a way for them internally to make that data available. And now I am going to pause my share for just a second.
Nick, I had a couple more questions come in if you have a second.
Yeah, go for it. I'm gonna see if I can.
Great.
Yeah, go for it.
So one question was, do funding agencies have preferences between institutional versus non-institutional repositories?
That's a good question. A lot of times there isn't always a specific preference. A lot of times in the call for proposals, the funding agencies will make a recommendation for a repository. For some disciplines, it makes more sense for you to put it in a discipline-specific repository, depending on the type of data that you're using, the size of the data. But typically, most of the time, there aren't any preferences. You just have to talk about which one you're going to use when you write your data management plan.
Okay, and also what would you suggest for those of us who prefer using applications like Excel or Word to work on our data? Since those are not the proper formats for DMPs, what would be a way for those of us more familiar with those to transfer them?
Yeah, so as I sort of mentioned this, but I may have gone a little too quickly. So it's completely fine while you're doing your data to say use Microsoft Excel and to work, analyze your data, to work on that data in Excel. And you can mention that. But my suggestion would be once you are finished analyzing that data or as you go is to save different versions of that or save a copy of that as a CSV file. Excel has the option to save in several different file formats, one of which is a CSV file, and that's an open source file that can be read by any spreadsheet program.
Wonderful, thank you.
You're welcome. So this is Re3 Data. This is the Registry of Research Data Repositories. And this is where I usually point folks when they come and ask for a research repository suggestion. As you can imagine, there are hundreds of them out there. It's impossible to keep track of all of them. This site is a really good aggregator of those. So to find those, I go up to this Browse button here, and I like to click on Browse by Subject. And then if we do that, as soon as it loads here, it gives us this really cool color wheel. And so this is broken out by sort of macro discipline and more specific disciplines. So this is a good way to start your search if you're not really sure where to begin, or if the funding agency doesn't give a specific preference for a repository. So say we wanted to look at the life sciences. So we can start here at the innermost part of the circle, and we can click life sciences. And you can see that broadens out a little bit or gets more specific. And now we have 3 areas to choose from. So if we choose, say, biology, and then let's go with, say, zoology. So you can keep making this a little bit more specific until you get to this point. And then let's say we try biochemistry. And so when we do that, you'll see we should get search results that have a listing of different data repositories that would be appropriate for this discipline area. You can see the Dryad is actually listed on here since we're talking about sort of biomedical data repositories. And then you can actually click on one that's interesting or looks interesting for your research. You can see there are tags for different subject areas. There's a description of the repository itself. There's also a link. There's also a URL for it. So you can access that repository directly from this site. And so this is a really, really awesome tool and website for finding an appropriate data repository. Like I said, if either the institutional repository doesn't suffice or the funding agency doesn't really make a suggestion. All right, so now we're going to go back into the presentation. All right, so we've talked a little bit about what goes into a data management plan. Now let's say you've got your information together, you've selected a repository, and you're ready to build your data management plan. So there's several different ways you can go about this. But for those that are looking for a good tool to start out, one that I would recommend and I'm going to talk about today is the DMPTool. So this is a tool that's been developed over the last 7 or 8 years by data librarians and other data professionals to guide you in writing your data management plans. This was developed in collaboration with many internal and external partners and experts within the field, including various funding agencies. It provides guidance for many different funding agencies, directorates, and divisions, along with a long list of links to additional resources, services, and help guides to further assist you, as you're writing that data management plan. And now I'm going to actually show an example of using DMPTool to build your DMP. So if I go back out of the presentation, and the first thing I'm going to do, I already have it open, but is to go to dmptool.org. And you'll see this is the homepage for the DMPTool. There's some statistics here that sort of gives you an idea of the information that's there. As you can see, it's pretty robust and it's growing. But I'm going to go here to the top and navigate to these buttons. So the first thing that you'll want to do is sign in. And you'll want to select, as long as you're affiliated with FSU, option 1. FSU is an institutional affiliate of the DMPTool, so it's free to use for anybody at Florida State University. And if I just type in the search, go to Florida State University, click go, and then it's going to prompt me to enter my FSU credentials. And then you'll get to this sort of page. Now, I'm already signed in. I've created a profile on DMPTool, so it takes me directly to my homepage. The first time that you log in, it may prompt you to create a profile. Just, your name, email, organization, language. You can also connect your ORCID ID with your profile, which is also really great. So if we go back to your dashboard, so on your dashboard, it's going to show 2 different things. So it's going to show any data management plans that you are currently working on or that you're working on with collaborators. And it's also going to show FSU plans. So these are plans that have been made openly available by others at FSU. You can see these have been in here for a few years, so they The guidelines may have updated since then, but these are some good examples to look at for these specific funding agencies if you're looking for some examples there. So in order to create a plan, you would go to Create Plan. And then you're going to want to first name your project. So I can say Sample Data Management Plan. I'm going to check that this is a project for testing or educational purposes. It allows those of us that are teaching these to do that. It should already have Florida State University as your primary research organization. And then it'll ask you to select your funding organization. This is going to let the tool know which template to select for you to write that plan. So if I say the National Science Foundation, and for the National Science Foundation, there's actually multiple templates from various directorates. You can see for NSF, it's pretty comprehensive. I'm just going to select the Biological Sciences division for today's example. So you can see now it says successfully created a plan, and now you can begin filling in your data management plan. On the first page, these are general project details, such as the title, the funder, the grant number, the project abstract. So I can say this is a sample DMP for today's workshop. And then the information for the principal investigator. This will just essentially consist of your name, email, and then a phone number if you wish to put that there. If the data contact person is different than the PI, you can uncheck this box and you can enter a different name for that. You'll want to include that in your data management plan as well. But in most instances, the principal investigator will likely be the contact person for the data management plan as well. So now we click Save, and then it goes to the next tab, which is the Plan Overview. And this page is a sort of very basic, very brief description of the different sections for the data management plan and what should be included there. So you can see we've already talked about the Biological Sciences Directorate, so you should already be familiar with all of this stuff because I just said it a little bit ago. But it will also give you this template here when you're going through DMPTool, just to sort of refresh you or to sort of, tell you what types of information you need as you're starting to write your plan. And so now we click on Write Plan, and this is where you begin to fill in all of this information. So you can see it now has a field for all 6 sections of your data management plan, and it has a space to fill in that information. So I actually have some sort of an example here. I'm just going to briefly fill this in. And you can save that, and it will save whatever you put in that particular section. And if we say roles, responsibilities, say the PI is responsible for stewardship of the data management plan. Click Save here. I'm not going to fill in all of these too detailed. There will be some examples available for everyone to view on one of the slides, so you'll have that when we send out the slides after the presentation. And then, archiving, storage, and preservation. This is where you would talk about the institutional or discipline-specific data repository. So as you go, it's going to fill in each of these. It'll say, 1 of 1, 0 of 1, etc. And one thing I'd like to point out that's really neat is over here on the right, you'll see that there's guidance or tips for each one of these sections. So one of the tabs has guidance directly from the funding agency. And the other one actually has guidance directly from DMPTool. So those that help to keep DMPTool running, those that have uploaded all of these templates. And you can see there's some nice tips here on what to include. So this is a little more detailed than what comes directly from the funding agency, and some considerations that you might want to think about. There's also a section here to add comments to share with collaborators. So if you are collaborating on writing your data management plan in DMPTool, and you have a comment or a suggestion for your other collaborators or colleagues, you can write that in this box here, and they'll see it when they next log in. So then the next screen is share. So on DMPTool, there are really 2 ways that the DMPs can be shared. I know there's a third one for organization. But essentially, these plans can all be set to private or to public. So you can be sharing it privately amongst just you and your colleagues or those working on your project. You can also make it public for anyone to view. And I'll show you where you can access those examples in just a minute. You can invite collaborators, and you can give them various permissions as well. And then the final thing you can do is download this. So if you fill all of this out on here and you want to then say copy and paste that into your data management plan, you can then download that as a CSV file, a text file. Usually you're going to be using Microsoft Word or some sort of word processing software. So you would download that plan. You can see here it downloads it as a text file, which you can then open in your word processor of choice. And then you can further edit it there, or if you have further questions, you can come to myself or some of the other folks at FSU Libraries for assistance. So that's a little bit on the dashboard in the Create Plan section. This is a really good tool to use as you're writing this plan. We're happy to look at these sort of when you're finished with this, just to make sure that it looks good and awesome, or if you have any questions. But this is really nice. It's been curated by other data librarians, other folks at different funding agencies. So this is a really great tool. And as I said, there are also some resources here if you want more information. You can see if you go up to Learn, there's a link for public plans. So this is what I mentioned earlier. If the researcher wishes, or whoever wrote the data management plan wishes, they can make their plan publicly available. And you can access those on the DMPTool. So if you say go to one of those, it brings up the plan that they wrote using the DMPTool. And then you'll see it has all the different sections and then their example. And so you can see all of these. You can download these. You can use these as examples when you're writing your own plans using your own data. If you wish to just browse funder requirements, if you're maybe not to the point where you're writing your plan yet, but you want to know what a specific funder's requirements are, you can go to this link under Learn as well. So you can go here, and then you can search for different funder requirements. So say you're working with a Department of Energy grant, and you want to know what the latest guidance is from the Department of Energy. You can go here, you can download as either a Word or a PDF document, what their latest guidance is, what the different sections of their data management plan are. And most of this information here comes directly from the funding agencies themselves. This is on their website as well, and you can see there's links directly to their policies. So a lot of this information is being pulled directly from there. It's just nice here. It's in sort of one place for you to browse and to look at. All right, and then just to sort of wrap up today's presentation, I hope this has given you a good idea of funder requirements for data management plans, how to get started writing a data management plan, and some of the information that you'll need to keep track of. Obviously, there's a lot of information here, and if you have further questions after today's presentation, your data librarians at FSU Libraries are more than happy to sit down with you in a consultation, whether that be via email or Zoom, or whenever we're able to get back into the office in person. And we can do that at any stage of the process, whether you're at the very beginning of writing a data management plan or whether you have written one and you just wish us to review it to make sure it's in compliance with those funder mandates. We also have a data management library guide, which myself and my colleague in social sciences have curated. And I'll put a link to that in the slides that I send after the presentation, so you'll have a link there. But it has a lot of really good information and some of the same things that I talked about today. We also can help with data intellectual property and copyright questions. We work really closely with our Office of Digital Research and Scholarship. So if you have any copyright questions, they're really awesome folks to speak with. As I said earlier, finding and selecting data repositories that are appropriate for your research, and then help with any of these data management tools, such as the DMPTool. If you have further questions, this is my contact information at the top. If you have any specific questions on social sciences research, you can also reach out to my colleague, Dr. Jessie Klein, who is our social sciences research and data librarian, and she'll be more than happy to answer those questions as well. So with that, I would like to again thank the Office of Research Development for giving me the opportunity to speak with all of you today. And I'd like to thank all of you for your time and attention. Thank you.